Hi, thanks for joining me on this video as we compare the philosophies of St. Thomas Aquinas, who lived in the 13th century, to Immanuel Kant, who lived about 500 years later, especially when it comes to epistemology, or their whole idea of how we come to know things, which is basically the root of what epistemology has to do with. There's a picture of Kant and some information about him. He was a German Enlightenment philosopher. He lived almost exactly 500 years after St. Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas was born about 1224, 25, and 500 years later came Kant, and of course a lot of other philosophers between the two of them. Kant is famous for his works, which include the Critique of Pure Reason, extremely influential writing in philosophy. It seeks to show the impossibility of one sort of metaphysics and lay the foundation of another. And so basically the one that he's trying to explain the impossibility of has to do with Aristotelian, Thomistic philosophy, and also the rationalists like Descartes and the empiricists, people like Locke and Hume and Berkeley. And so really what Kant came up with was very original, but in many ways it was also very destructive of the foundation of what had already been kind of set by Aquinas and some of the others. All right, he is famous for his Copernican Revolution in philosophy, which we'll talk a lot about during this video, and also his categorical imperative, which was his contribution to the field of morals and ethics. We're not going to talk about that in this video, but that might be a good topic for another one. He influenced Georg Hegel and Friedrich Nietzsche, to also problematic philosophers, and he himself was influenced by René Descartes and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And so you can see kind of the effect that these philosophers have on one another, and there's a whole lot of impact that one philosopher comes up with something and then somebody else takes it and runs with it, and in many cases makes it even worse. So what I'm going to do is show you three writers who are explaining basically the Copernican Revolution in philosophy according to Immanuel Kant, and I credit them. The first one, Martin Asiner, and I'll just kind of read what he has to say and then give some commentary and also explain why I have a picture of a frog up on the top of the screen. It will all come together. So Martin Asiner says, Copernican Revolution is a term by Kant that suggests the previous way of looking for knowledge, that our knowledge comes from and conforms to objects in the external world, actually had things backwards. Objects in the external world conform to our knowledge. Okay, so we see this frog. Imagine you're walking on a path and you see a frog. The classic way of understanding it is that we come to know the frog, or the essence of the frog, the form of the frog, through our mind and our senses working together, and so we come to a knowledge of it. Well, Kant is saying, nope, that's not how it is that the objects have to conform to our knowledge. Okay, so he totally turned the whole thing around. All right, so let's keep reading. This seems counterintuitive and looks forward to the 20th century post-structuralism that says rather than reality creating language, it's language that creates reality. Okay, so the whole lot of philosophers after Kant took this idea of kind of turning things on their head and upside down from the way people used to think. Kant argued that since objects must appear to us in accordance with the sensible forms, or photons, entering our minds via our senses, in order to be known, it follows that we can know them only as they appear and not as they truly are. So in this case, we sense the frog, and that our senses inform our intellect, but Kant is saying, well, that's not entirely reliable, because really it's what we are producing through our senses that are informing the intellect. And so he saw that as being problematic. Thus, human knowledge is limited to appearances or phenomena, whereas things in themselves, as they truly are in the external world, can never be known or knowable. Kant had a name for things that are unknowable due to the inability of people to truly see these things as they truly are. Such things he called noumena. We can think about them and fantasize about them, but we can never know for sure anything about them, or even if they exist at all. Kant has a name for this entire process. He calls it transcendental idealism. Now, interestingly, one of the things that he would consider under noumena would be God himself. And one of the key points that Aquinas makes in the Summa is that God is most knowable. Okay, that God, because he is pure act, is can be known. Okay, and we come to know him through his effects and through his grace. But Kant would not agree with that. He would say that God is not knowable because we can't sense him, right? All right, so here's another guy, John Soshaw, and he says about the Copernican Revolution, at the time when Immanuel Kant introduced this term himself, Isaac Newton's view on time and space was the dominant view. Newton believed that time and space were absolute entities that existed independent of human minds. Kant's turn is pretty simple in this way. He believed that time and space did not exist in spite of humans, but because of humans. So again, Kant is giving all of it to us. We're creating, through what he called categories, the time and the space, rather than it being something that exists apart from us. And the other key thing about this is that God has an attribute of eternity. God has an attribute of infinity, and so God is everywhere. God, is space. God is outside of time. So when you start jacking with our perception of time and whether we create it or we experience it, it really has a lot to do with our experience with God. Okay. Time and space are a product of our perceptual abilities. Time and space are the way in which we perceive the world. Time and space are transcendental, meaning that they are the foundation upon which we sense and perceive anything at all, or they are the lens through which we perceive the world. So Kant is, again, making us the sun, and all these other things are orbiting around us rather than us going out and discovering the truth in the world. Time and space is not something we sense from the world. It is something we project to the world, according to Kant. This was the exact opposite of Newton's position. So according to Kant, it would be nonsense to talk about time and space without human minds. Okay, so if there were no human minds, then there would be no time and space, because the time and space is created by the human mind. All right, so the last one I'll show you is a gentleman by the name of Will Thomas, and he says Kant's Copernican Revolution put the human mind at the center of reality in the way Copernicus put the sun at the center of the solar system. This was intended to solve various metaphysical puzzles. Why must there be space, time, and logic? Because our minds insist on them and force us to perceive them as real. Reality is such we cannot know. That's Kant's view. Okay, so again, everything's upside down. It's a terrible error, part of a turn towards focusing on the mind at the expense of reality. It undergirded rationalism in the name of saving empiricism. So as I mentioned before, you've got the rationalists like Descartes and Spinoza and Leibniz, and then you had the empiricists like Locke and Berkeley and Hume, and Kant was trying to find some kind of resolution between rationalism and empiricism, and this is what he came up with. All right, so why does this matter? Well, throughout our typical day, we are interacting with the world, right? And we see the world like the people in this picture, and they see the bike and the chair and the table and the desk and each other, and how the relationship of how we come to know these things matters, okay? And Kant's view would be very, very different than St. Thomas Aquinas. So what would Aquinas say? Okay, we're going to go through a few brief articles here, just excerpts from articles. Aquinas believed that we had a passive power of our intellect. The intellect, he says, has an operation extending to universal being. We may therefore see whether the intellect be an act or potentiality by observing, first of all, the nature of the relation of the intellect to universal being. Very important. For we find an intellect whose relation to universal being is that of the act of all being, and such is the divine intellect, which is the essence of God, in which originally and virtually all being pre-exists as in its first cause. Okay, so all being, all things, all ideas first pre-exist in God. Okay, and then God creates a world, and we, by coming to know this world, to understand the world, come to know God. And you can see where, with Kant originating everything in us, he's turned that upside down. So we're no longer really seeking God in the world and learning about God. It's all coming from us. We created it, okay, according to Immanuel Kant. Okay, we'll keep reading here. And therefore, the divine intellect is not in potentiality, but is pure act. But no created intellect can be in an act in relation to the whole universal being. Otherwise, it would need to be an infinite being. Wherefore, every created intellect is not the act of all things intelligible by reason of its very existence, but it's compared to these intelligible things as potentiality to act, and like a clean tablet on which nothing is written. Okay, that's very classic Aristotelian Thomism, is that we are born and we experience the world. This is also empiricism, is that we don't really know anything until we experience it. We don't know a dog until we see a dog, or touch a dog, or smell a dog, right? Okay, as the philosopher says, who is Aristotle, this is made clear from the fact that at first we are only in potentiality to understand, and afterwards we are made to understand actually. Now, some philosophers, even Plato, believed that we had the innate forms of all things the moment we were born. Okay, so this is a big, big debate among philosophers about how the relationship between the things that we come to know and the human mind. All right, so Thomas also believed that there is an active intellect in the soul of the human being. This is part 1, question 79, article 4. Thomas says there needs be some higher intellect by which the soul is helped to understand, wherefore some held that this intellect, substantially separate, is the active intellect, which by lighting up phantasms, as it were, makes them to be actually intelligible. And we know this by experience, since we perceive that we abstract universal forms from the particular conditions, which is to make them actually intelligible. Okay, so this is, again, Aquinas is not separating the reason and the senses. He's saying that they work together, as did Aristotle, in order to come to know things. Okay, the senses inform the intellect, but we seek the truth in the world. Okay, we don't create our truth. We don't create space and time and categories, as Kant would say. Therefore, the power which is the principle of this action must be something in the soul. For this reason, Aristotle compared the active intellect to light, which is something received into the air. Okay, so the active intellect kind of lights up what we come to know, which is potentially in the passive intellect. Okay, one more. Whether our intellect understands corporeal and material things by abstraction from phantasms. A lady opens up a refrigerator. She sees a bunch of things. She has sense experience with this, and then an intellectual experience with it. Thomas talked about the universals and the particulars. So she sees this particular jug of milk with her senses, but then her intellect is able to universalize that to all the jugs of milk that she ever saw in her life, and that commonality of essence between all those things. All right, so real quickly, since matter is the principle of individuality, therefore every power of the sensitive part can only have knowledge of the individual, okay, the individual thing of milk. There's another grade of cognitive power which is neither the act of a corporeal organ nor in any way connected with corporeal matter, such as the angelic intellect, the object of whose cognitive power is therefore a form existing apart from matter. But the human intellect holds a middle place, for it is not the act of an organ, yet it is a power of the soul, which is the form of the body, and therefore it is proper to it to know a form existing individually in corporeal matter, not as existing in this individual matter, but to know what is in individual matter, not as existing in such matter. It is to abstract the form from individual matter, which is represented by the phantasms. Okay, so imagine that picture of the frog that I showed earlier. I wish I had it. What is the next slide here? Okay, so these two are walking on a path. They see a tree. Okay, they see that one particular individual tree, but they're able to universalize it, and this one individual tree is a tree because they know treeness. They know the essence of a tree, and this one particular tree is part of that grouping or universality of treeness that they've experienced. Okay, so Kant would say that the treeness began in the person and it was imposed on the world, whereas Aristotle and Aquinas would say, no, we came to discover that tree and the universality of treeness through our experience of the world, our senses working with our intellect. Okay, so finally, very last thing, Thomas asks in question 47, article 1 of Prima Pars, why are there so many creatures in the world? Why do we need, 7,000 species of snakes and pigs and grasshoppers? And he says, the distinction in multitude of things comes from the intention of the first agent, who is God. For he brought things into being in order that his goodness might be communicated to creatures and be represented by them. And because his goodness could not be adequately represented by one creature alone, he produced many and diverse creatures, that what was wanting to one in the representation of the divine goodness might be supplied by another. For goodness, which in God is simple and uniform, in creatures is manifold and divided, and hence the whole universe together participates the divine goodness more perfectly and represents it better than any single creature whatever. So we'll quickly go back to this picture, and in Aquinas' view, we experience these beautiful things, and there's something about them that we discover about God, universal being, the universal goodness, right? Because they have being, they have goodness, they have degree of perfection. So we're discovering God. In Kant's view, we are projecting that onto the world. We're not discovering the world. We are creating our own reality of the things that we have come to know. And so you can see how, in one way, we're seeking for God through our life, and another way, we are basically God. Okay, I don't know that Kant meant it that way, but that's the logical conclusion of a philosophy like that, and that ultimately it eliminates our awe and wonder of the world and the sense of discovery of exactly what we are to come to know about God through our experience of the created world, using our senses and our reason working together as a composite individual human being. Thanks for watching. God bless you.